I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Alice Hastie, who is the owner of Sycamore Disability and Business, to talk a little bit about access to work. So for those of you who know me, my name is Tanya Martin. I'm the founder of an organisation called PegSquared, and I talk about everything in relation to neuroinclusivity in the workplace. And access to work can be a huge part of that in terms of how individuals get access to adjustments within the workplace. So I'm absolutely delighted that Alice has said yes to talk to me about the access to work process, and hopefully she will help us demystify it a little bit, because it can be quite complicated. So Alice, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Hello everyone, I am Alice Hastie. As Tanya says, I run Sycamore Disability and Business, and I often say I live, breathe, sleep access to work. It's a 24-hour thing going on inside my brain. So no, I support individuals and organisations with every part of the access to work process, and I see, because I kind of dip in and out with where people are with the process, I see kind of the full range of parts of that process, and I also very much keep up to date with what's going on politically, what's going on with the data. So access to work is my business.
Your business. So before we dive into the hows and the what does it do and everything that potentially you can support with, what is access to work?
Absolutely. So I find it unimaginable that somebody wouldn't know exactly what access to work is, because I've, talk about it all day long, but it does turn out that there are people who've never even heard of it, or people who've heard about it but don't really know what it means. So I'm trying to think about how I put it in a nutshell, but access to work is a government grant, and it's important to understand it's a grant, not a government benefit. That difference may not be obvious to some people, but it means there aren't kind of statutory rights around it like there are with other disability benefits like personal independence payment or employment and support allowance. It's a lot more discretionary. You can't go to appeal courts. It's a very different process. And in terms of if you as an employer and an organisation, the main thing for you to understand is that access to work kicks in to pay for the support that is beyond what you provide as a reasonable adjustment. So often people are like, okay, access to work, but where does it fit in? What does it do? And it's all those things that, you have a legal obligation as an employer to provide reasonable adjustments to your disabled employees. And what's reasonable is going to massively depend on the context of your organisation, the context of that individual employee's team, their specific role, their needs. But a lot of it comes down to, realistically, affordability, which is a key part of what is something reasonable. So really, with access to work, you're looking at the support that you have decided that you as an organisation cannot reasonably fund. So if you're a very large corporate, then there's lots of things you should be funding. Realistically, what would be considered reasonable for you as a international corporate organisation, you'd be expected to be providing most assistive tech, I would say, unless it was very specialist equipment. I would be expecting maybe for you to provide some coaching. But once you get into somebody to support work on site with them all day, every day, rather than just maybe a few hours here and there at events, we're starting to say that's probably beyond reasonable. If they need a lot of sign language interpreting support, if they need some very expensive equipment, let's say they need a specific power wheelchair to access your sites, these are the kind of things for you that might be considered beyond your reasonable adjustments and access to work can pay for. Now, on the other end of the scale, let's say you're a very small cafe. You might have 10 employees. What will be considered reasonable for you to provide for your disabled employees is going to be vastly different. You might provide some relatively basic bits of equipment, maybe adaptive equipment to help them do something in the cafe, to use the equipment that you already have, to hold cups, to hold crockery. You might give them a tray to carry stuff rather than them carrying it by hand. You might give them a trolley. Really depends what their issues are. But you're not going to be paying for things that cost several £100s. You're not going to be paying for coaching. You're not going to be paying for any kind of specific equipment. You're certainly not going to be paying for support workers. So access to work would kick in at a lot kind of lower cost. So when access to work, really, it's about looking at where your reasonable adjustments stop, and therefore when access to work might come in. And in terms of what it actually does, as I say, it's a grant provider. So they provide funding for very specific types of support. So let's talk about sign language interpreting. Somebody would apply to Access to Work and say, okay, I need a sign language interpreter 3 days a week. Access to Work would say, that's fine. We're prepared to give you 3 days a week of sign language interpreting at, I don't know, £500 a day. And then you would go away, you'd find the sign language interpreter, maybe your employee has a preferred provider, you put that in place, and then you make claims to be reimbursed for any of those costs related to sign language interpreting. So it's not something that where support is provided, you are still providing that support, you and your employee are in control of that process, but you will be reimbursed up to a certain amount by Access to Work.
Amazing. That's such a useful definition, because we very often talk about reasonable adjustments and what is reasonable.
Yeah.
And the reality of that is that it is incredibly grey.
Yes,
and it
absolutely.
is very much depends on the size of the organisation and the cost of the ask. That is, have I accurately kind of
yeah, there's a
reflected
few
that
other things, you know, so often it might be the practicality of putting that change in place.
Yes.
So it might not be costly, but it might be impractical based on the resources that you have, the space that you have, the way that your shift patterns work, all sorts of stuff. And there's a few others, you know, what you do shouldn't impinge on the health and safety of others involved, including yourself. It should have a chance of working, or that bar's quite low. We wouldn't tend to look at that, but it's not some hypothetical, well, there's a 10% chance this might work. It's got to be a reasonable expectation. The thing will remove the barrier the individual is facing. I feel like there's another one that I've forgotten, but the two big ones really are always going to be, as far as, in my opinion, affordability and practicality.
Practicality, brilliant. Thank you. That's helped me in terms of understanding it a little bit better. And I talk a little bit about reasonable adjustments. I don't spend a lot of time on them, because what was really interesting in my role when I was at EY is, particularly in the neurodiversity space, the reasonable adjustments, not everybody needed them, not everybody wanted them. And actually, when we look at neurodiversity specifically, a lot of the things that help those that are neurodivergent tend to be ways of working before
Absolutely.
to expensive items. And we both know there's a lot of technology available already inbuilt into Word and
Absolutely.
Microsoft tools and Google tools and everything else that already exists.
Yeah. So I've pinched a really nice little pyramid model from an organization called AHEAD, which is to do with higher education. I can't remember what AHEAD stands for, but you can look at it, and it's a pyramid model, and it's around what's it called? Universal design for learning, I guess it would be. And I've pinched that, and because it's lovely and it's really simple, but just like you've got this pyramid model, and at the bottom, the base of your pyramid model is the idea that you're trying to design an inclusive environment, an inclusive working environment that is generally accessible to most people, and that is broader than disability. There's all sorts of barriers and needs that people in your workforce are going to have, and particularly in a larger organisation, actually the aim is to design out the need for reasonable adjustments and access to work as much as it is possible to achieve. You know, if you can make it so that people don't even have to tell you they have a barrier, but they just have access to a catalogue of IT, they don't have to justify it, it's just on their computer, or there are just ways of requesting flexible working without having to explain the whys and the whatever, or you just have it built in, well, you know, you have to be in these core hours, but everything else is flexible. You know, the more that things are just accessible in general, reasonable adjustments should only be for those people where they need to disclose because actually they need something a little bit extra. And then again, that should be a robust process, so that again, access to work is really for only those things beyond that, so that you know you're using all the different levels wisely and consciously.
Yeah, sounds like a great model. Love to see that.
As I say, it's very simple, but people look at it and they go, oh, right, now I get that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let's talk about how people can access it.
Absolutely. So this is where it can get a little bit complicated, because although you as an employer will be expected to support and implement an Access to Work award, it is an award for your employee. It is not for you, it's not for the organisation. So the only person who can make that application is your employee. They can make an application without you knowing, which you will find out about it, but you may find out about it a lot further down the line. So in general, a lot of the ways to try and influence and be involved is just about having that really good supportive culture in your organization anyway. The more that your employees trust their managers, trust their colleagues, trust more senior managers, with letting them know that they have disabilities, letting them know that they need adjustments and that maybe they need to apply to access to work, is by making sure that there is an open, trusting culture and they feel able to talk about those things. In an ideal world, you would be supporting an employee through every step of the application in terms of even identifying whether an application is needed, because hopefully you should have done your reasonable adjustments beforehand. Maybe a workplace needs assessment, and from there working out what you can implement and what you can't, and then from that launching into an access to work application. But yeah, ideally you'd be sitting with them all the time through that, so that they end up with some funded support that works for them, but also works for you as an organisation. So some of the horror stories might be that somebody's waited 9, 10, 11 months for some support from access to work, and then access to work funds software and equipment that can't be implemented within your security policies, within your procurement policies. And if you are involved in the process, you can make sure that the employee and the awarding case manager knows to give the right, knows what operating system you have, knows what parameters you have, knows whether you're looking at, well, we don't allow anything that's on a server, or we only allow software that's, in the cloud. Do we do AI? Do we not do AI? All these things are really important. And you should not be trying to control the process in terms of your employee, but the ideal is that you're walking that together. You're making those decisions together. Now, in terms of how you access it, your employee will make an application. They fill in a form online, or they can phone the helpline and do that. Applications can take a little while. So if they're already in post, let's say you've got somebody who has newly disclosed a disability, or perhaps they've newly acquired a disability, they're going to be waiting quite a long time for support. So it's really important you think about what you can do in the interim to support them, because they're going to be waiting around 9 months at the moment to be spoken to by access to work. So it is a while, which is why we also say using it wisely, in as much as you don't want to wait 9 months to find out that really you should have done reasonable adjustments 9 months ago, rather than kind of waiting to be told what to do by access to work. So they're going to make an application. You're going to wait some time. A case manager will contact them first, and then they'll probably contact you to just confirm that this person is in the post they say they are, that they have the responsibilities they say they have. They shouldn't be asking you about your view on whether or not their disability means what support they need, because that's the expertise of the individual. You can give your perspective on, what things you may have observed they may be struggling with, but you should not be you're not expected to understand their medical information or to provide authority on that. And then basically there'll be a lot of toing and froing between the case manager and your employee. They'll probably have to provide paperwork, documentation, evidence, and you can definitely support your employee with that, even if it's just making sure they've got time in the working day to answer phone calls, fill in this paperwork, take it off to the post office, because a lot of it's by post these days. But also, in an ideal world, line manager and employee would sit down together and fill in some of this paperwork. They might have to attend assessments, but at the end of it, access to work will make a decision about funding. They will send a letter to your employee, they'll send a letter to you, which very clearly states exactly what's being funded and the precise funding amount, and also whether you as an organisation have to make any kind of contribution. So if you're larger and that person's been in post for more than 6 weeks, then you'll probably have to pay the first amount, either £500 or £1,000, depending on your size, for any kind of software and equipment that's provided. And then 20% of anything up to the first 10,000. Now, these are slightly complicated calculations. It's easier to see it written down. You can look online, Google access to work employer fact sheet, and it'll be in there. But the maximum you would be expected to pay would be £3,000 across 3 years. So there is a cap on that. Now, in terms of, but slightly putting everything I just told you on its head about you should be looking at inclusion, then you should be looking at reasonable adjustments, taking your time, working out how to apply to access to work. I've mentioned there's these really long wait times. You can bypass the long wait times if you've got a new employee or somebody moving into a new role within your organisation. So if they apply to access to work anything up to 4 weeks before they start their role, then they'll be prioritised. So they might be spoken to within 2 to 4 weeks by access to work. So it's a really big difference. So in order to make use of that, you should be discussing reasonable adjustments with anyone you've offered a job to, not asking them what their disabilities are, asking if there's any adjustments they need made to their job, and signposting to access to work and saying, if you know that you're going to rely on expensive support, probably support workers really, if you're going to rely on support worker support or you need any particular equipment, then please apply to access to work before you start, and perhaps offer some support. But obviously that goes against everything I've just said about, taking the time, putting in place the reasonable adjustments, working out what somebody needs, and then consciously going to access to work. And there's no good way of reconciling those two things. Like they don't reconcile. You have to find a way, but it's about particularly trying to catch those people who wouldn't be able to start work without it. So if you've got somebody in who needs sign language interpreting in order to start their job, they really need to apply to access to it beforehand. It's not a matter of waiting 9 months will not be acceptable. No. There might be other people who would benefit from some extra software, but maybe there's things you can tide them over with a slightly less premium version until access to work comes along, or you might be able to slightly adjust what they're doing in terms of their job until access to work support kicks in. But it's for people who are like, well, no, I literally won't be able to access your building unless we have that ramp installed, or I get my sign language interpreting, or I have a support worker in place to help me get into and move around the office. These are kind of really key things. So I'm not sure how clearly I explained that, but that's roughly how you access to it.
Yeah, it was super clear. I think that the two things, just playing it back to you, is that if there is going to be something that is potentially significantly costly or practical for the individual to join the organisation before they start, do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
If the person is already in role, then your first port of call is actually their workplace needs assessment.
Exactly.
And working with the individual about actually what does the individual need and what can you as the organisation provide. And if then at that point it's like, well, actually there's some things there that might fall outside of what we can support you with, that is when you get access to work involved.
Absolutely. And it's probably important to say that access to work only funds and discusses fundable reasonable adjustments. So they're not going to, they might send your employee for a workplace needs assessment report, and some people will say, yeah, so why can't I just wait and send somebody for their access to work workplace needs assessment? Why do I need to pay for my own, or have occupational health, or have conversations with the manager? And apart from timescales, a really key point is access to work is not going to consider anything related to ways of working because it's not fundable. So they're not going to give an opinion on, well, actually this person needs instructions followed up in writing, or they need to be able to work from home, or they need, because it's not relevant to them because they can't pay for it.
That's really interesting. So which makes this complex for employers, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Not only is there a grey area around what reasonable adjustments are, but there's also this complicated piece of that, if it can't be funded, then actually the organisation has to make a call on that as to whether or not they will support it. So thank you. It's super interesting. So thank you so much for everything you've shared so far. Let's dive into the current situation around access to work. So we've already mentioned that there's a 9-month wait.
Yeah.
I know when I set up my company back in almost 2 years ago now, it was 4 months. So it's gone up quite a bit in that time. And I can also share that in the 2 years where I have had a bit of access to work funding for some tech and some support, my award has changed quite significantly. It's gone down quite a lot.
Yeah.
So what's going on? What's happening?
Big things. So we've got really 2 strands of change. is probably how I would normally look at it. So we've got the really big political strategic stuff. So last summer, the government published their Get Britain Working, I think it was called, Get Britain Working white paper, which kind of detailed out the problems of mainly unemployment to disabled people and people with, you know, the rise of costs in disability benefits and unemployment. Not those two things are always necessarily linked, but, you know, lots of people on disability benefits are working. But looking at the costs associated with that, and kind of with the goal of trying to get people who are out of work due to long-term health conditions and disability into work or into better paid work, and ideally off disability benefits as far as the government is concerned. And they then, following on from that, they launched a consultation to get people's views on that paper. And one of the key sections they asked about was access to work reform. So a lot of it was PIP. You've probably seen all sorts of things in the news about PIP reform. But for us, crucially, there was a section about access to work. And it didn't really give much detail about exactly what they wanted to do with it. Just very much that application rates have really soared. They believe that's due to an increase in people with mental health issues and neurodivergent conditions, but they don't really know because the data is not there for access to work. Well, that's not really true. Okay, so I'm doing my putting together my evidence submission to submit by midnight tomorrow because I'm a bit late, and for the parliamentary committee inquiry. And it's definitely correct that people who are within the category of mental health conditions and other, which is where they believe autism and ADHD is being put, is the cause of this increase. However, which condition category you're put into is down to the case manager and is down to the first condition that you put on your form. So if you put, and if you do it alphabetically by anxiety, autism, ADHD, then of course working in the space, we know that most people have more than one condition, often have a mix of mental health conditions, neurodivergent conditions, what we might call chronic health conditions, and disabilities. So you don't normally just get like one diagnosis. So it's a bit of potluck which thing they put you into, and they have about 10 different categories for all sorts of different physical impairments, and then they have 2 for what they call like mental impairments, which is not the right term, but wow, that pot. So the data, sorry, that's a bit complicated, but the point is the data is poor. The data is extremely poor. They bang on about, oh, it's being driven by autism, ADHD, and mental health issues, but that is not backed up by good evidence. We don't know why there's more people applying to access to work. It's a really strong theory that it's, you know, we know there's an increase in ADHD diagnoses particularly, but actually the evidence is not there for that. Where was I going? Okay, access to work. For whatever reason, more and more people are applying to access to work, more money is being spent on access to work, and the government is worried about that. They're worried about it not being sustainable. And at the same time, we know that access to work only supports a tiny fraction of the working disabled population. So it's something like 1%. So it's not having a broad impact on supporting disabled people into employment. So they're kind of looking at, well, what do we do with this? How do we make it financially sustainable? How do we make sure it's effective in achieving its aims? So we had the consultation last year. That response was kind of people gave responses and then the government summarised those. On the back of that, we had some collaboration committees. So there was an access to work collaboration committee where they got people, representatives from disabled people's organisations. We had individual, like lived experience representatives, and probably some more professional people. I think there was 12 people in the group. I think they met 5 times. So they had this collaboration committee that met and obviously discussed all sorts of things. That's completely secret. We don't know what happened in those conversations. They've refused to publish the minutes because they're still mulling them over. About the same time, the National Audit Office started an investigation into the effectiveness of the scheme. They've just published their report in, I think it was January. And again, off the back of that, there's now a parliamentary committee, and they are currently requesting evidence, which I have to get to them by midnight tomorrow. And I'm very late in writing that. So all that to say, really, just that there is a huge political, strategic conversation going on about what do we do with access to work in the future? How's it going to be run? Should it continue as it is? And if so, how do we make it more financially sustainable? How do we make sure it's got better data? The data is appalling. They have no idea what they're funding and if it's working.
Wow.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of challenges with it. So that's the big picture, and we are continuously waiting for something to be clarified. And obviously, the more investigations and committees, the longer it gets a bit drawn out about what we're going to see big picture wise in terms of access to work. But now the other strand is really what we're already seeing. What are we seeing day to day operationally in access to work? And over the last 2 years, really, but really escalated in the last 12 months, is we're seeing operational changes to access to work. So both in terms of how access to work is operated. So for example, access to work has historically been a very email focused communication, is emails between case manager and employee. It's been very easy for the claimant, certainly. And you would send documents by email, you'd have casual conversations by email, and they've just changed that. So now all communication is moving towards, not quite there yet, but moving towards phone calls being prioritized and sending documents by post. So that is a very big change. And it's not entirely accessible for disabled people. Phone calls often come out of the blue, or you might get an hour's notice. So in terms of you as an employer, particularly being understanding that if you're waiting for that call from Access to Work, people may have to duck out of meeting. They have to take the call when it comes. They may not have much choice about when they do that. So that's a big structural change. And again, we've had changes in the complaints process, and all these ways of working with Access to Work are changing. And at the same time, we're seeing changes in the decisions they're making, which, as you personally experienced, and I've personally experienced, essentially comes down to cuts in funding. So anybody applying for the first time now, compared to say 3 years ago, is likely to get less funding than we would have expected them to get 3 years ago. And those of us who already have existing awards, particularly for travel and support workers, because they're the things that kind of keep going on, we're seeing massive cuts when it comes to renewal, which happens every 1 to 3 years. So I won't go into all the details about that, but overall, we're seeing it's getting harder to get that funding.
Wow. It sounds like there's a huge amount going on.
There is a huge amount going on.
Creating a little bit of chaos for anybody that's involved in the process.
Yeah, and unfortunately, things change so fast. So, you can blink, go on holiday and come back, and a whole way of doing things has changed and you didn't realise. So it can be a little bit hard to keep on top of.
Yeah.
But it is still, I would like to reiterate, I always like to make it very clear, it's a fantastic, even with all those problems, it's an amazing scheme that changes people's lives and enables you to retain really high skilled, valuable disabled workforce, but also disabled people to stay in employment. So it's not in any way a scheme that is not worth applying to. It's extremely useful. But we are fighting some challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. How do you help people in relation to access to work?
I help people in all sorts of ways. So I personally, as I said before, I help individuals and organisations. So when it comes to individuals, I do one-on-one advice sessions, casework, advocacy. I run training courses, and I run some online communities. So very much helping individuals to navigate that scheme. And when it comes to organisations, whether that's employers or people who are not employers, but using Access to Work for other reasons. So for example, they might be a supported employment provider. So I'm doing some work with our local employability scheme at Bristol City Council, but they wouldn't consider themselves to be the employers, or providers to support services which are funded by Access to Work. So assisted tech, coaching, that kind of stuff. So I work with them to understand the scheme and how it relates very specifically to their circumstances.
Yeah.
And the way I do that is normally upskilling. So that would be things like training and workshops. So kind of working out what they need in terms of training, and it's going to really vary from organisation to organisation, making sure, and targeting it at that. So sometimes it might be people who are very familiar with Access to Work and casework, and they really want to focus on one very specific element of that. Whereas a broader employer, you'd be thinking, okay, well, who do we need to know about it, and what do we need them to know, and how do they find out more information? I do one-on-one advice. So a really easy way of getting advice if you're in HR or you're a manager or you're in DEI or you're lead of a disability network and you're like, I need to know this thing about access to work. I've got questions. I need this thing resolved. I just do really easy bookable advice sessions from my website. So you can just book 30 or 60 minutes with me for some time that week and we can just talk through the individual problem. So I say that's probably like the easiest thing. And then beyond that, we have kind of let's talk about training, about consultancy. So looking at policies, processes, where should access to work, where are the touch points where we should be talking about access to work? How do we do that? How do we support line managers to navigate? Not everyone can't be an expert on access to work. So what do we need them to know? And when do we need them to go and seek more information if things get a bit more complicated?
Yeah.
But it's often, you can't really look at access to work entirely by itself. It's kind of where does it fit in with those reasonable adjustments with other things that are happening within the organisation. Yeah. But yes, what would I say? Wait, how do I summarise that? One-on-one advice, easy to book, do it from my website, use a card, no contract, suppliers, any of that nonsense. And then actually coming in as a trainer and a consultant to kind of look more bespoke at what support you need with access to work.
Amazing. Thank you. And where can people find you? Where's the best place to get in touch?
Everywhere. No, mainly LinkedIn. I haven't been very active at all this year because I've been unwell, but LinkedIn, I'm normally pretty chatty on there about access to work. So anybody can connect with me on there, send me a message. But other than that, I've got a website, which is sycamorebusiness.co.uk. And it kind of explains what the support that I provide, how to get in contact. People can email, they can WhatsApp, they can Facebook message me if they want to. But yeah, I'm on all the things. I think the only thing I'm not on really is Instagram and TikTok. I mean, who knows how to use TikTok? I don't post on Instagram or Facebook, but I'm there, and you can contact me on Facebook. If you have
group in Facebook as well.
Yeah, so if you have employees who'd like to know a bit more for their own about what access to work is, they can join my Facebook group. So it's called very imaginatively Access to Work Claimants. So they can join there and ask questions, and we can support them. We can support them on there. But yeah, I'm kind of all over the place. Google Alice Hastie, you'll find me.
Amazing. Thank you. And thank you so much for taking your time to explain this. I've learned a huge amount just from sitting listening to you. And I talk about neurodiversity and adjustments all the time with organisations. So it's just really, and I know how tricky this area is for people to navigate. So that has helped me as well. So thank you from me for taking out the time to talk a little bit about what you do.
No problem. I could talk about access to work all day. People have to stop me.
I love it. Brilliant. Thank you so much.